The morning broke with a brittle stillness, the kind that hangs over eastern France in late November when the cold has settled into the soil. Frost clung to the hedgerows around Morville-Lesvic, and the low clouds pressed hard against the horizon, muting the sound of distant artillery. Along the forward American positions, tank engines idled in uneven rhythm, their crews watching the fog for movement. What they saw instead was trouble. The German line had stiffened overnight, and the momentum of the advance was slipping away in the chill air. By mid-morning, field reports carried a sharper tone. Patrols returned shaken, speaking of concealed guns and counterattacks probing for weak points. The message that filtered up headquarters was simple and urgent: send armor now, or the front will bend in ways that cannot be repaired. Officers studied the maps with tightening jaws, knowing that every hour lost would harden the German defenses further. Reinforcements were not a luxury. They were the last thread holding the line from unraveling. Into this tension rolled a formation few on the battlefield had seen before. Their tanks were standard, their equipment familiar, yet the men who stepped down from them carried a different kind of weight. They were the 761st Tank Battalion, a unit forged in segregation, trained in isolation, and sent to Europe with expectations set uncomfortably low. Most of its soldiers were African American, serving in a structure that questioned their worth long before the enemy did. Their arrival drew glances of curiosity, and for some, quiet skepticism. Across the lines, German intelligence officers reviewed their own assessments and dismissed the battalion with unsettling ease. In their reports, the 761st barely merited a footnote, written off as inferior before a shot had been fired. It was prejudice disguised as military analysis, and yet it shaped decisions that would soon cost them dearly. Even among American commanders, hesitation lingered. Years of institutional bias whispered caution, urging them to place their hope elsewhere. But the battlefield cares little for inherited doubt. Under the weight of necessity, orders were issued. The 761st would move first, advancing under fire into the tangled defenses ahead. The opening salvo left the barrel with a hard metallic cough, vanishing into the mist. No one knew yet what their performance would mean. Only that the long campaign had begun, and in the cold haze beyond Morville-Lesvic, the future waited to be revealed in smoke. By 1944, the United States was fighting a war on two fronts, one declared against Hitler and another unspoken within its own borders. Segregation remained woven into American law, shaping where a man could live, learn, and serve. Newspapers spoke of freedom, yet millions of citizens tasted it only in fragments. This contradiction followed black soldiers into the ranks, a shadow carried beside their uniforms. They were asked to defend a democracy that did not fully defend them. Inside the army, these tensions hardened into daily routines. African-American tankers trained on proving grounds that tested their patience as much as their skill. They learned gunnery, maintenance, and armored maneuver with the same precision as any other unit, yet combat assignments were rare, withheld with the quiet implication that they were not ready, or worse, not capable. The 761st Tank Battalion felt this burden constantly. Their officers drilled them hard, knowing that each mistake would be judged twice, once as soldiers and again through the lens of prejudice. Over months of training, the men of the 761st learned to navigate scrutiny from both directions. Ahead of them lay the enemy, methodical and relentless. Behind them stood an institution hesitant to trust its own decision to send them to war. This dual pressure forged a discipline that was less about perfection and more about endurance. They understood that each mile they advanced would challenge not only the enemy's lines, but the assumptions of their own nation. Their tanks bore a symbol born from this tension, a black panther poised in silence, its body low and watchful. It was not chosen for aggression, but for resolve. A panther fights only when forced, yet when it does, it commits fully. For the men of the 761st, the emblem was both identity and armor, an image that spoke when others would not listen. From this came a simple phrase that captured their reality: "Come out fighting." It served less as bravado and more as a reminder that hesitation, for them, was a luxury. Each operation would demand clarity and courage in equal measure. When they entered Europe, the welcome was uneven. Some officers viewed them as an administrative complication rather than reinforcements. Others watched with quiet curiosity, waiting to see if the battalion could justify its place. But beyond the forests and river valleys ahead, the enemy's artillery offered no opinions. It measured worth only. In survival, an assessment the 761st was prepared to meet head-on. And soon the first test would arrive, carried on the rumble of distant guns. The 761st entered combat without the customary period of adjustment that most new units received. There were no quiet days to learn the terrain, no staged skirmishes to test their coordination under European skies. Instead, their orders were immediate and uncompromising. Move to the line and reinforce the sector before the enemy exploited the weakening front. It was a baptism not shaped by strategy, but by necessity, delivered at a pace that left little room for hesitation. Rain had begun in the early hours, steady and cold, turning the narrow French roads into rutted channels of mud. Sherman treads churned the ground into a thick paste, forcing the battalion to crawl rather than advance. Fog clung low between the hedgerows, blurring distances and hiding threats until they were nearly on top of them. Somewhere in the gray distance, German anti-tank gunners lay in wait, their sights searching for the faintest outline of American steel. Every bend in the road felt like a threshold to be crossed carefully, knowing that a misjudged angle could be fatal. The first contact came abruptly. A platoon guiding the battalion's left flank edged through a break in the hedges, unaware that a concealed Paquet 40 was angled directly upon them. The gun's report cracked through the mist, and the lead Sherman shuddered under the impact. Flames followed, fed by ruptured fuel lines. Within minutes, the crew had abandoned the vehicle, shaken but alive. The loss was a shock, sudden, brutal, and unmistakably real. Training fields in Louisiana had never fired back with such precision. In the seconds that followed, the men understood how quickly the battlefield could strip away confidence. War was not a sequence of rehearsed maneuvers. It was a shifting landscape that punished the slightest misstep. Their inexperience under enemy fire was evident in those first exchanges, and German units monitoring the sector captured it in their reports. Messages filtered through enemy radio nets describing new enemy armor, poorly handled, as if the battalion's performance had been measured and dismissed in the space of a single encounter. Yet the 761st did not retreat. They absorbed the loss, realigned, and drove on. Tank by tank, they pushed through the hedgerows, engines laboring against mud and shrapnel. Artillery burst overhead in dull, concussive flashes, splintering trees and showering dirt across the hulls. Still they moved, slowly, methodically, learning the rhythm of combat one hard lesson at a time. By day's end, the shock had settled into resolve. They had been doubted by nearly everyone, friend and foe alike. But when the line threatened to buckle, it was the 761st that held fast, and the war was only beginning to reveal what it demanded of them next. 3 years before the 761st Tank Battalion rolled into France, a quiet but consequential judgment had already been written against them. In 1941, the U.S. Army War College released an official assessment claiming that Black Americans were mentally unfit for complex combat roles, particularly those requiring rapid decision-making under pressure. The language was clinical, detached, and deeply flawed, yet it carried the weight of institutional authority. It shaped policy, training pipelines, and the very architecture of opportunity within the Army. For thousands of volunteers eager to serve, the verdict felt like a sentence handed down before the trial had even begun. These ideas filtered through the system with remarkable endurance. Classification boards used them to assign duties. Instructors cited them when explaining why certain men would never see a turret or a cockpit. Commanders referenced them in personnel discussions, often without realizing how thoroughly prejudice had been dressed in scientific terms. The result was a military that welcomed Black manpower but doubted Black capability, a contradiction that hardened into the routines of wartime mobilization. For many white officers, the assumption seemed self-evident. They believed that Black troops lacked the emotional steadiness required to operate armored vehicles under stress, machines that demanded coordination, technical precision, and a calm response to sudden danger. This belief became an unofficial guideline, handed from one officer to another like inherited wisdom. It influenced performance evaluations, promotion decisions, and the level of trust placed in entire units. In some battalions, the bar was raised impossibly high. In others, it was never set at all because no one expected the men to reach it. On the training grounds of the 761st, these doubts could be felt in the air. Instructors executed their duties, but encouragement was rare and praise even rarer. When a crew completed a gunnery drill with near-perfect timing, the accomplishment was noted but seldom acknowledged. If the why struggled, It was taken as confirmation of the War College's prediction. Every maneuver, every misfire, every hesitation was measured against an invisible standard that few dared to articulate openly. The men trained not only against the Army's curriculum, but against its expectations. Higher up the chain, senior commanders spoke in private about the battalion's future. Some quietly predicted the 761st would never reach the front. Others believed the unit would serve in labor roles, far from the armored clashes that defined the European campaign. Paperwork reflected this caution. Deployment lists were revised, postponed, and reconsidered. The battalion's own officers sensed the hesitation, watching as their men mastered the mechanics of tank warfare, while the Army struggled to imagine them in combat. Yet the soldiers of the 761st responded with quiet determination rather than resentment. They studied technical manuals late into the night, tracing diagrams of hydraulic systems and turret assemblies until the pages softened at the edges. They memorized firing tables, calibrated azimuth indicators, and learned to repair their engines in darkness. Each man understood that knowledge was armor, protection not only against the enemy, but against the very institution that doubted them. And then in Europe, reality intervened. The demands of the battlefield eroded long-held theories, revealing a war too vast and costly to be constrained by outdated doctrine. Combat did not care about academic assessments or racial assumptions, it cared about capability. When frontline divisions called for reinforcements, they needed tankers, any tankers, who could move, shoot, and endure. It was here, amid the cold fields and shattered towns of 1944, that the Army's old verdict began to unravel, one engagement at a time. Long before the 761st rolled into the villages of Lorraine, the German High Command believed it understood the measure of every opponent it faced. Nazi ideology had seeped into the Wehrmacht's evaluations as thoroughly as it had shaped the regime's politics, defining entire categories of soldiers as inherently inferior. To them, non-white troops lacked discipline, resolve, and the steadiness required for modern mechanized warfare. These convictions were not treated as prejudice, but as military fact, woven into planning documents and intelligence briefings with unsettling confidence. When German signal units intercepted early American radio traffic mentioning colored tank battalions, the reaction was one of contempt rather than curiosity. Officers reviewed the reports with the certainty of men who believed they were reading the future. If such units existed at all, they assumed they would be poorly trained, slow to respond, and easily broken under the pressure of an armored assault. Few considered the possibility that these assumptions might themselves distort operational judgment. In a war filled with unknowns, racial arrogance became its own form of reconnaissance, flawed, comforting, and dangerously misleading. Propaganda outlets amplified these beliefs. Newspapers and radio broadcasts claimed that Black American crews would scatter at the first hard engagement, unable to withstand the shock of artillery or the confusion of armored combat. The message was crafted to reassure civilians, but also to fortify German troops with a sense of superiority. If the enemy was weak by nature, then every confrontation was already half won. Even seasoned officers, though experienced enough to doubt political claims, absorbed the broader message. These tankers were not to be feared. Along the front near Lorraine, tank destroyer detachments prepared ambush positions with this expectation firmly in mind. Crews of Jagdpanzers and Paquet batteries set their guns along narrow lanes, confident that once the enemy entered the killing zone, the engagement would be brief. They anticipated a quick strike, a scattering of American armor, and a return to their positions before dusk. Their preparations were meticulous, but their assumptions shaped the way they read the terrain. They waited for panic, for retreat, for hesitation, signs they believed inevitable. Yet myths have a way of narrowing one's vision. The idea of Aryan superiority influenced not just German morale, but the tactical lens through which they observed the battlefield. It created blind spots where analysis should have stood. Officers expected weakness and therefore looked for it, interpreting every moment of American caution as proof of racial inferiority, while overlooking the discipline and coordination that were developing within the 761st with every mile advanced. As the battalion pushed through Lorraine's sodden fields, these assumptions began to meet resistance. The 761st did not break. Their movements were deliberate, their gunnery steady, their resolve unmistakable. Each time German forces prepared for an easy victory, they encountered instead a unit learning rapidly, adapt. under fire and refusing to yield the ground it gained. The German predictions, once delivered with absolute certainty, no longer aligned with the reports returning from the front. By late November, the confidence that had once framed the German understanding of these tankers began to falter. What had seemed like an immutable truth was now a liability, a strategic insight built on ideology rather than observation. And ahead, the battalion would move toward positions where German disbelief would be tested even further, one engagement at a time. While the nation debated the roles black soldiers should be allowed to fill, the men of the 761st lived a different reality entirely. Far from the front, on training grounds in Louisiana and Kentucky, they worked through days that stretched from early dawn to the edge of darkness. What began as routine preparation soon became something more intense, more deliberate. They understood that if they wished to reach the battlefield at all, they would need to exceed standards rather than merely meet them. And so the battalion trained longer, harder, and under stricter conditions than most armored units in the Army. Their Shermans reflected this determination. In an era when tank maintenance often lagged behind operational needs, the 761st insisted on pushing their machines beyond regulation tolerances. Engines were stripped down and rebuilt until they hummed with near-mechanical precision. Turrets were traversed again and again until every crew could feel the timing of the gears as if they were part of their own anatomy. These efforts were not the result of official instruction, but of necessity. They knew they would be inspected more harshly than other units, their mistakes magnified, their shortcomings attributed to something other than circumstance. To counter this, they trained until error itself seemed like a form of betrayal. Technical skills became a language they learned fluently. Gunnery drills were repeated in rapid succession, forcing loaders and gunners to move as one. Drivers practiced sudden pivots, hill climbs, and tight turns until the tank's weight felt less like a constraint and more like an extension of their own movement. Maintenance teams rehearsed repairs in dim light, simulating the conditions they might face under fire. Coordination exercises were run until the battalion moved with an ease that disguised the discipline beneath it. What the Army doubted, they forged into routine. In this environment, figures like Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers emerged with quiet inevitability. He was not elevated by rank or rhetoric, but by presence, calm under pressure, focused in moments when others faltered. His leadership developed not through formal ceremony, but through the trust of men who saw him take on every challenge with a steadiness that invited confidence. Rivers became a model for what the battalion needed, someone who understood the burden they carried and refused to be diminished by it. For many within the 761st, excellence became a shield against systemic prejudice. They believed rightly that their performance would be examined more closely than that of any other armored battalion. Their success would be attributed to chance, their failures to race. In this equation, mastery was the only protection. It was not pride that drove them, but survival within an institution that questioned their worth long before the enemy ever had the chance. Yet beneath this discipline lay an unspoken truth. No amount of preparation could soften the brutality of combat. Manuals did not describe the sudden violence of a shell striking steel, the disorientation of smoke filling the turret, or the sound of a wounded comrade in the narrow space of a tank. They trained to face these realities, but none could fully anticipate them. When orders finally arrived sending the battalion overseas, the men accepted them without celebration. There was no bravado, no bold declarations. Only a quiet determination, shaped by the knowledge that they were entering a war they had never been expected to fight, and were now prepared to face on their own terms. Ahead lay Lorraine, and the baptism of fire that would test everything they had built. Lorraine in late autumn was a landscape shaped by centuries of quiet farming, not by the hard geometry of armored warfare. The villages were narrow, their streets laid long before the concept of a tracked vehicle existed. Stone houses pressed close to the road, their walls thick and cold, casting shadows that swallowed entire tanks. As the 761st advanced, these passages became both shelter and threat, corridors that funneled movement and magnified every sound. Engines rumbled against the cobblestones, echoing through alleys that twisted unpredictably. For the tankers, visibility shrank to fragments. A glimpse of a courtyard, a flash of rooftops, the fleeting silhouette of a steeple rising above the fog. Within this maze, danger hid at arm's length, German. Panzerfaust teams favored these ancient villages, slipping into doorways and behind rubble piles, waiting for a Sherman to cross a street at the wrong angle. The Panzerfaust was simple, light, and brutal at close range. Fired from only a few dozen meters, it could tear through a tank's armor with horrifying efficiency. For the 761st, every intersection became a test of instinct. A moment of hesitation could be fatal, a moment of haste equally so. The men scanned windows and broken walls, knowing that an unseen figure could end the entire crew's life in seconds. Survive, the battalion adapted with a speed that surprised even seasoned officers. Infantry cooperation became the rule rather than the exception. Foot soldiers moved alongside the Shermans, clearing paths, checking corners, and watching for the faint flicker of movement that betrayed an ambush. Tanks, once accustomed to broad fields, now performed tight maneuvers through medieval lanes. Rapid pivots, sudden reverses, and short, controlled bursts of fire replaced the sweeping engagements of open country battles. It was a different kind of warfare, intimate, tense, and punishing, and the 761st learned it yard by yard. In these conditions, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers proved indispensable. Again and again, he positioned his tank to draw enemy fire, deliberately exposing himself to danger to warn nearby crews of hidden guns. When he spotted the outline of a Paquet 40 concealed behind a barn, he maneuvered into its line of sight before calling out a warning over the radio. The German round struck his tank, shearing off armor and filling the turret with smoke, but the message saved two neighboring Shermans from the same fate. Rivers' actions were not reckless. They were calculated extensions of his responsibility to the men he led. In the cramped, unpredictable villages of Lorraine, that sense of duty became a survival mechanism. Between engagements, maintenance transformed from routine care into a lifeline. Crews worked under the pulse of distant artillery, their hands moving through practiced motions even as the ground trembled beneath them. Tracks were retensioned, engines cooled, and machine guns stripped and cleaned by lantern light. Mechanics crawled beneath hulls while shells thudded into nearby fields, each repair a gamble against time. The Shermans were sturdy machines, but the terrain and the constant strain of combat demanded vigilance. A broken track or overheating engine could immobilize a tank at the worst possible moment, turning it from weapon to target. Casualties mounted as the battalion pressed deeper into the region. The lists were read in hushed tones at dawn, the names of wounded and killed mingling with the morning fog. Yet with each loss, the battalion's instincts sharpened. Communications improved. Crews learned to anticipate the angles of attack favored by German teams. The rhythm of battle became less chaotic, shaped by experience rather than uncertainty. The men no longer moved as individuals reacting to threat, but as a cohesive force responding with practiced coordination. By late November, commanders observing the 761st began to revise their assessments. Reports that once carried cautious language now described the battalion's movements with respect. Their gunnery was precise, their timing disciplined, and their ability to operate under continuous pressure exceeded expectations. What had begun as an untested unit, doubted by their own army and dismissed by the enemy, was now regarded as a reliable armored force capable of holding ground under the hardest conditions. Ahead lay new towns and new resistance, each demanding the same clarity and resolve. Patrol revealed new hazards, camouflaged positions, sudden ravines, and sniper nests that had gone unnoticed in maps and reconnaissance. Lessons were learned quickly, sometimes at terrible cost, as men fell to the unseen and the unexpected. Yet with every failure came an adjustment, each mistake cataloged, analyzed, and transformed into procedure. Patience became a weapon. Small squads learned to stalk Japanese positions silently, moving through the dense undergrowth with measured steps and controlled breathing. Every movement was deliberate, every pause considered. Marines observed patterns in enemy behavior, timing patrol rotations, and learning when to press and when to hold. Night, once the domain of Japanese advantage, was now an extension of American adaptability. Darkness no longer hid danger. It became a tool of opportunity, allowing Marines to close in with precision rather than desperation. Flamethrower and demolition teams emerged as indispensable assets. They moved ahead of the main line, rooting out defenders entrenched in bunkers, caves, and reinforced positions that conventional assault could not overcome. The hiss of flame and the crack of explosives shattered the illusion of safety, forcing hidden troops into exposure or surrender. These tools, combined with disciplined rifle fire and supporting automatic weapons, allowed the Marines to maintain the initiative even in the most hostile terrain. Japanese observers, often recording these encounters in hurried diaries, noted the Americans' mastery of combined arms in miniature. Riflemen, bar gunners, mortars, and scouts worked as a cohesive unit, each element anticipating the other. Suppressive fire, reconnaissance, and maneuver were integrated at the squad and platoon level, creating a system of war that seemed greater than the sum of its parts. The Empire had never encountered an opponent so capable of blending individual initiative with rigid cohesion. Medical and logistical innovations quietly amplified this advantage. Casualty evacuation, once chaotic and slow under fire, became streamlined. Wounded Marines were rapidly removed from the line and replaced with fresh troops, allowing units to maintain strength far longer than their Japanese counterparts. Every improvement, no matter how small, reinforced endurance, resilience, and morale, creating a cumulative effect on the battlefield that the enemy could neither anticipate nor easily counter. Japanese diaries reflect a mixture of respect and unease. One officer wrote simply, "They fight like hunters." The metaphor was telling. Americans did not merely advance. They tracked, observed, and struck with patience and precision. The Marines' willingness to innovate in the face of danger, to blend tools, tactics, and timing, became a quiet but decisive advantage. Their adaptations, invisible to those expecting conventional combat, reshaped the conflict in microcosm, allowing a relatively small force to dominate terrain far larger than their numbers would suggest. By the end of each engagement, the lesson was clear. Guadalcanal had become a laboratory of war, and the Marines were its practitioners. Adaptation, discipline, and innovation were no longer abstract qualities. They were weapons as effective as any rifle or mortar. For the Japanese, the realization slowly took hold. These men were not only surviving the storm of jungle combat, they were mastering it, turning every challenge into an opportunity, every encounter into evidence of an enemy unlike any they had faced before. And as the undergrowth settled after another firefight, the Marines paused only briefly. New patrols moved forward, flamethrowers and scouts ready, applying the lessons of yesterday to the battles yet to come. Innovation, quiet and relentless, had become their most potent weapon. As the war spread across the Pacific, the Marines evolved from competent infantry into a force meticulously engineered for amphibious warfare. Divisions were organized not only for attack, but for seamless integration of land, sea, and air, a system in which every man, weapon, and vehicle served the broader rhythm of assault. Each landing became a demonstration of preparation and coordination, the result of years of doctrine refined through trial, combat, and relentless training. Japanese defenders quickly discovered that no beach could be approached without enduring a preliminary storm of naval gunfire. Cruisers, destroyers, and battleships opened fire in sustained barrages, shaping the terrain before the first Marine set foot on sand or coral. Where previous invasions might have allowed defenders to hold their positions against uncoordinated assaults, these preparatory strikes softened obstacles, disrupted fortifications, and created corridors of opportunity that only disciplined attackers could exploit. The Empire had never faced a force so thorough, so precise, and so unflinching in its opening moves. Amphibious tractors, armored and resilient, carried troops through the surf even as shells struck around them. Men disembarked under fire, advancing with rifles ready and eyes trained on the enemy. The combination of mobility, protection, and coordination gave the Marines a foothold that would have been impossible for earlier forces, allowing them to establish positions under conditions that might have destroyed less prepared units. Each successful landing reinforced the principle that preparation, technology, and doctrine could converge to overcome numerical or positional disadvantage. Small unit cohesion became the silent backbone of every operation. Squads trained to operate independently within the larger assault executed maneuvers that mirrored the intent of the entire division. Leaders at the platoon and squad levels made rapid decisions in complex terrain, improvising within doctrine while maintaining cohesion. Even when disrupted by terrain, enemy fire, or logistical delay, these units functioned almost as autonomous engines of war, advancing, suppressing, and adapting with remarkable efficiency. Marine aviation layered yet another element onto this integrated assault. LT, dive bombers, fighters, and close air support coordinated with forward observers on the ground, delivering precision strikes that shattered previously unassailable defenses. The Japanese, accustomed to predicting the tempo of infantry movements, were confronted with an opponent whose reach extended vertically as well as horizontally. Defensive positions that had once relied on concealment and massed fire were exposed to a multi-dimensional force operating with unprecedented synchronization. Reports filtered back to Japanese commanders describing men who fought through exhaustion, hunger, and stress with unshakable tactical clarity. The audacity of the Americans, combined with their discipline and adaptability, confounded expectations. Units that should have faltered instead pressed forward, leveraging combined arms, reconnaissance, and small unit initiative to maintain momentum even under the heaviest fire. The result was the emergence of the Marine machine, a force whose efficiency and precision became a symbol of fear among the defenders. It was not simply the men, nor the weapons, nor the vehicles. It was the system itself, coordinated, adaptive, and unyielding. Beaches, ridges, and jungle passes were overcome not through luck, but through the integration of doctrine, training, and innovation. To the Japanese, it was a force that fought like a single organism, relentless in its advance, unbroken by fatigue, and terrifying in its predictability of success. And yet, as another island's shore came into view on the horizon, the Marines prepared to land once more, armored tractors ready, artillery calibrated, and squads poised to operate in harmony. The machine had learned from every encounter, every obstacle, every ambush, and it would carry those lessons forward into the battles yet to come. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, surveyed the coral atoll with quiet certainty. "They cannot take Tarawa in 100 years, he promised his superiors, the words carrying the weight of decades of defensive doctrine and the confidence of men who believed in the unassailability of fortified islands. His men, entrenched in bunkers, pillboxes, and reinforced emplacements, had spent months preparing for the inevitable assault. Every sandbar, every reef, every patch of coral had been surveyed, mined, and defended with painstaking attention. In his mind, the Americans approaching the lagoon were destined to falter before even reaching the shore. But the Marines did not falter. The assault began under conditions that would have broken any conventional force. Tides misjudged, waves lapped higher than anticipated, and landing craft ground to a halt on submerged reefs. Men waded through waist and chest-deep water, their packs heavy with ammunition, rifles, and flamethrowers. Bullets struck the surf around them, cutting swathes through the advancing lines. Despite the chaos, the squads pressed forward, exploiting every dip in terrain, every slight shadow for cover. Forward momentum, discipline, and training held them together as the sea itself threatened to stall the attack. Japanese defenders watched in disbelief as Americans crawled through the surf under direct machine gun fire, each man moving with an almost mechanical determination. The enemy had anticipated hesitation, fear, and the instinct to seek cover, yet these Marines seemed immune to instinct itself, advancing methodically despite the devastation surrounding them. The combination of small unit initiative, suppressive fire, and sheer determination allowed them to close distances that had been calculated as impassable. Each step toward the fortified positions was a lesson in the cost of underestimating an opponent engineered for both endurance and aggression. Pillboxes fell not to luck, but to preparation and audacity. Explosives were planted at point-blank range. Flamethrowers spat fire into bunkers, forcing defenders to retreat or perish. Marines moved in deliberate waves, supporting one another as teams cleared each fortification in turn. The sound of hissing flames, detonating charges, and the disciplined rhythm of rifle fire became the soundtrack of a siege that defied expectation. Where the defenders anticipated terror and retreat, they encountered methodical, relentless aggression. Astonishment ran through the Japanese ranks. Survivors reported men who continued to fight despite wounds that would have ended others' participation. Each casualty was replaced, each position reinforced, yet the momentum never slowed. Tactical clarity, coordination, and sheer endurance combined to create a force that moved with the inevitability of a machine while retaining the cunning of a predator. Tarawa, once considered an impregnable stronghold, became a proving ground for the ethos of the Marine Corps. By the end of the first day, the Empire confronted an uncomfortable truth. Shibasaki's promises, the doctrine of impregnable fortifications, and the years of Offensive preparation were insufficient against a force trained to integrate firepower, initiative, and resilience at every level. The Marines did not merely assault the island. They imposed a system of war that the defenders had never encountered, one in which adaptation, coordination, and endurance outweighed entrenched certainty. Tarawa entered the record books not just as a tactical engagement, but as the moment Japan fully understood what the Marine Corps represented. Discipline hardened into machine-like precision. Small unit initiative became a force multiplier. Each landing, each breach, each advance etched a warning into the memory of the Empire. These men would not falter, would not retreat, and could endure what others could not imagine. And as the sun sank over the shattered reefs and smoking pillboxes, the Marines paused only briefly, already preparing for the next objective. In their wake, Tarawa remained, a name burned into memory, a warning written in blood and courage, and the first unmistakable signal that the Marine Corps had arrived as a force that would redefine warfare in the Pacific. The beaches of Saipan were alive with fire long before the first Marine boots touched the sand. Officers, observing the initial waves from landing craft, feared the worst. Intelligence predicted heavy resistance, but the reality surpassed even the most pessimistic estimates. Machine guns tore the surf to ribbons, artillery cut arcs of death across the coastline, and mortars rained destruction into every shallow channel. Some commanders whispered that as many as 50% of the first assaulting force would fall before reaching the inland defenses. Yet, the Marines pressed forward, each man conditioned to act with discipline under conditions that would have shattered any lesser formation. Japanese forces, convinced that sheer mass could still break an enemy, launched counterattacks of unprecedented scale. Thousands surged forward in tightly packed formations, relying on shock and morale to carry them through the hail of bullets and shells. The defenders had honed the Banzai charge into both ritual and weapon, a culmination of doctrine that had succeeded countless times before. But against the Marines of Saipan, the calculation failed. The Americans had learned from every island, every reef, every embattled shoreline. Their response was immediate, coordinated, and devastating. Artillery, tanks, and naval gunfire were synchronized with an efficiency that astonished observers. Spotters in the hills, on ships, and embedded within infantry units relayed corrections with a precision that made the battlefield a controlled system of destruction. When Japanese forces pressed, they were met not by piecemeal defense, but by the combined might of an integrated force. Waves of attackers were shredded before they could reach the first line of Marines, each volley reinforcing the harsh lesson that traditional mass assault was no longer a viable strategy against this opponent. Dismounted Marines moved inland with methodical precision through cane fields and the labyrinth of volcanic caves. Each squad acted as both scout and suppressive element, maintaining formations that allowed fire to cover movement while minimizing exposure. Terrain that should have favored defenders, the thick cane, uneven ridges, and hidden caves, was neutralized by training and coordination. Marines communicated through radios, hand signals, and prearranged patterns, closing gaps that might have been exploited in earlier wars. The largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War came next. Tens of thousands of Japanese troops surged forward in a desperate gamble, hoping to pierce the American line through sheer determination. They met immovable firepower instead. Bar gunners, machine gun crews, and rifle squads combined into lethal intersections of fire. Artillery rounds landed precisely in the ranks, naval gunfire carved corridors of destruction, and tanks annihilated the unshielded. Within hours, the charge collapsed completely, leaving devastation and silence where a force had once believed victory certain. Japanese commanders, forced to observe from forward positions and scattered posts, witnessed the annihilation of an entire division. Doctrine, morale, and strategy, everything that had once dictated battlefield success, had failed in the face of disciplined, integrated, and adaptive American forces. Confidence, once absolute, fractured in real time, as officers realized that the war they had trained to fight no longer existed in the form they had expected. Saipan fell not simply as a tactical victory, but as a strategic watershed. The perimeter of Japanese defense in the Central Pacific began to collapse. The myth of invincibility, reinforced by decades of victories, was shattered. In its place stood a new reality, a Marine Corps capable of absorbing fire, adapting, coordinating, and annihilating even the most determined counterattack. The Empire learned that its traditional doctrines, mass assault, reliance on morale, and shock tactics, could no longer hold against a force engineered for endurance, precision, and relentless advance. As the smoke lifted over the bloodied beaches and shattered cane fields, Marines prepared to press onward, their momentum unbroken, their system intact. Saipan was more than a victory. It was a warning, a confirmation of what the Marine Corps represented. A machine of discipline, coordination, and inexorable power that would define the next phase of the Pacific War. Iwo Jima rose from the Pacific like a blackened sentinel, its volcanic slopes carved into a fortress designed to kill every invader. Concrete bunkers, interconnected tunnels, and concealed artillery positions transformed the island into a labyrinth of lethal intent. Every ridge, every crater, every scarred slope was a deliberate obstacle, engineered to funnel attackers into zones of concentrated fire. Japanese planners believed that any landing force would be exhausted and broken before reaching the heart of the defenses. Yet the Marines advanced with silent resolve, step by step, through interlocking fields of fire that would have crushed less disciplined troops. Riflemen, bar gunners, and machine gun teams moved in concert, each aware of the protective fire offered by comrades and the lethal reach of supporting units. Movement was deliberate, rehearsed, and adaptive, exploiting every fold of terrain, every shadow, every crest that offered momentary concealment. They did not hesitate. They did not pause to mourn the fallen. Progress was measured not in fear or fatigue, but in yards gained and positions seized. Japanese defenders watched in disbelief as the Americans dug in immediately after every advance. Each foothold gained was fortified, fields of fire recalculated, and observation posts manned with relentless attention. Entrenchment was instantaneous, transforming small gains into strongholds capable of absorbing counterattacks. It was a rhythm of action and reaction, a cycle that eroded the defenders' expectation that the enemy would tire, hesitate, or falter under constant fire. Flamethrower teams and demolition squads became indispensable tools in the assault. Underground tunnel networks, previously assumed impregnable, were reduced to rubble as fire and explosives forced defenders into exposure or submission. Each breach was precise and methodical, a blend of training and courage that left Japanese officers reassessing every assumption about American tactics. Where doctrine had emphasized avoidance of prepared positions or reliance on artillery, the Marines turned doctrine into execution, integrating weapons, men, and terrain into a system of relentless pressure. Casualties mounted with every advance. Blood and smoke stained the volcanic sand, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the ridges and tunnels. Yet discipline never fractured. Even amid devastation, squads maintained formation, leaders made rapid tactical decisions, and firepower was applied with meticulous coordination. Fear and exhaustion were present, but they did not dictate action. Training and ethos carried each Marine forward. Japanese officers, recording what they could in journals and field notes, noted the uncanny composure of their adversaries. "They fight as if already resigned to death," one wrote, capturing a phenomenon that combined courage, calculation, and the inexorable acceptance of sacrifice. It was a level of resolve that transcended individual bravery. It was institutional, systemic, and terrifying in its predictability. Iwo Jima solidified the Marines' reputation as a force capable of taking any objective, regardless of cost. Every bunker reduced, every tunnel neutralized, every ridge seized was a testament not to chance, but to preparation, discipline, and integration of tactics. Across the volcanic island, the pattern became unmistakable. These were not men who simply reacted to fire. They imposed a system of war, one in which adaptation, coordination, and sheer will fused into a machine that could endure, absorb, and advance under conditions that had once seemed impossible. And as the blackened slopes smoldered with spent ordnance and shattered positions, the Marines paused only briefly. New objectives loomed beyond the ridges, and the lessons learned in fire, smoke, and cratered ground would carry forward. Iwo Jima was not merely a battle. It was the moment the Marine Corps was defined, a demonstration to the Empire that no fortress, no doctrine, and no fear could halt a force engineered to persist and prevail. Reports began to circulate with increasing frequency, the kind that commanders had long avoided. The Marines were not just soldiers. They were the most formidable American formation the Empire had ever faced. Accounts came from survivors, from scouts and officers who had endured direct contact, and from forward observers who had watched lines of men advance with precision that seemed unnatural. Every story shared the same pattern: unbroken squads moving under fire, coordinated, adaptive, and relentless. Survivors described the fear that gripped them at the first sign of a Marine squad advancing. The movement was slow, deliberate, and synchronized, each man in step with the others, each rifle, bar, and machine gun working in harmony. To those on the receiving end, it was as though they were hearing not men, but a force with weight and intent, methodically closing the distance with inexorable pressure. Where previous American units had been assumed hesitant or pliable, these troops projected inevitability, an unstoppable presence that compressed space and shattered expectation. Naval gunfire, coordinated with ground advances, compounded the effect. Offshore, cruisers and destroyers executed barrages with uncanny timing, supporting every maneuver of the infantry with fire that struck with both precision and psychological impact. What had once been considered the singular advantage of entrenched defenders, the combination of prepared positions and morale, was neutralized by integration and foresight. The Marines made firepower, coordination, and endurance indistinguishable from methodical strategy, leaving the defenders scrambling to react to a force that refused to be shaken or broken. Japanese doctrine, long rooted in assumptions about morale, shock tactics, and the limits of human endurance, began to fracture under the weight of experience. Traditional beliefs that Western troops would falter under concentrated pressure, that moral fortitude could substitute for training, that spiritual preparation would outmatch bullets and explosives, were confronted by the stark evidence of battlefield reality. Commanders who had relied upon these precepts were forced to acknowledge a simple truth. These Marines could endure, adapt, and press relentlessly where others would retreat. Even the myth of spiritual superiority, once considered the cornerstone of imperial confidence, faltered beneath the weight of observation. Officers quietly recorded instances in which Marines advanced through hailstorms. Dawn broke over the Pacific in April of 1944 with a stillness that felt almost deliberate. The water, pale and unbroken, stretched to the horizon, and yet beneath that placid surface, an unseen American hunter moved with purpose. No smoke trailed behind it, no shadow marked its presence. To the Japanese sailors, the morning seemed ordinary, but in truth, the ordinary had already abandoned. The morning of June 6, 1944, dawned over the Normandy coast like a pale, trembling promise. At 05:30, the horizon filled with the silhouettes of thousands of Allied aircraft, wings stretching across the sky in an almost mechanical precision. The low hum of engines created a river of sound, relentless and deafening, while below the beaches waited, desolate, fortified, and unaware of the storm above. To anyone on the ground, it must have seemed an unbroken wall of metal and hope. To the men in the cockpits, it was a sky poised between triumph and catastrophe. Already the first problem made itself painfully clear. Amid the organized chaos, pilots struggled to distinguish friend from foe. The gray-blue haze of early morning, combined with the heat shimmer rising from the beaches, turned every plane into a ghostly silhouette. For a brief, terrifying instant, every shadow in the air could be the enemy, or worse, an ally. The instruments told one story, the eyes another, and in that divide, uncertainty took root. A single, fatal moment crystallized the danger. Gunners opened fire at shapes that moved too quickly to identify, tracer rounds arcing through the sky with mechanical indifference. One aircraft, a Spitfire rising too fast through the formation, erupted in a shower of sparks as bullets tore through its fuselage. Inside, the pilot wrestled with disbelief. The enemy he had trained to hunt was nowhere in sight. Only the telltale markings of his own squadron flashed across the wings before the cockpit went silent. Fear settled into every cockpit like a weight. A young lieutenant, barely 20, realized with a jolt that he was being targeted by his own side. The gunner above him hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for a human heartbeat, too short to prevent catastrophe. He could see the glint of a helmet, the movement of hands, friends, not foes, and yet the machinery of war did not wait for recognition. In those seconds, fear became a concrete presence, heavier than any bomb or anti-aircraft shell. On the ground, commanders confessed to a grim reality. They knew from endless simulations and practice runs that friendly fire was inevitable. "We have prepared for casualties," one officer admitted later, his voice even but haunted. It was an admission without solace. Precision, in theory, was impossible, and chaos had already claimed a dominion over the sky. Their only hope was that the scale of success would outweigh the scale of mistakes. The statistics were horrifying in their abstraction. The invasion depended on flawless coordination. Tens of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, and hours of synchronized flight. One misstep, one misread signal could multiply errors exponentially. Yet the numbers, while exact on paper, could not capture the human cost, the split-second decisions, the trembling hands, the prayers whispered in cockpits. And so a quiet, unsettling question lingered over the airfields and the waves alike. How many would die at the hands of those who had come to save them before the sun even reached its zenith? The sky was crowded, beautiful, and merciless. Below, the beaches waited, and above, the engines droned, indifferent to the answer. The skies over Normandy were a labyrinth, threaded with invisible corridors of metal and noise. On D-Day, more than 13,000 aircraft would be airborne in a single morning, carrying troops, gliders, paratroopers, and supplies. Each plane had a mission, a window of time, a slot in a choreography that left no room for error. To move such a mass safely, pilots had to thread through a sky crowded with their own, their wings brushing against each other in close formation, engines screaming, radios crackling with instructions that often arrived too late. This was the war's most dangerous bottleneck. Even the best technology could not guarantee safety. Radar, still in its adolescence, had gaps that left vast swaths of sky blind. Identification friend or foe transponders were unreliable, their signals patchy and sometimes non-existent. Pilots could not rely on instruments alone. They had to see, to judge, to trust their eyes. And in the morning haze over Normandy, vision often betrayed them. A Spitfire could become a silhouette of a Junkers, a C-47 vanish into the glow of the rising sun, and a split-second hesitation could turn recognition into tragedy. Training itself contained a cruel paradox. Pilots were drilled to fire quickly, to seize fleeting opportunities before the enemy could act, yet they were simultaneously taught to identify slowly, to confirm before committing. In combat, these lessons collided. The mind, compressed by stress and speed, often made the choice for them. Muscles acted before judgment, and guns spoke before pilots could whisper the name of their target. Psychology compounded the problem. The pressure of combat, the roar of engines, the scent of cordite, the weight of thousands of lives below pushed men to act prematurely. Fear harpened reflexes but dulled reason. One hesitation could mean death. One snap judgment could kill a comrade. Bomber crews who had flown over Sicily and Italy remembered the screams of men felled by their own bombs, the endless regret that lingered long after the smoke cleared. Commanders, reviewing every report, sought patterns in chaos. Silhouettes were too similar, lighting too poor, and the human eye too fallible under stress. They traced every near miss, every misfire, every wrong target, trying to calculate the unpredictable. Yet calculations could not capture the intangible. The way a cloud could hide a formation, the way sun glinted off a wingtip at exactly the wrong angle, the way fear bent perception in its own cruel shape. With each passing hour, the fear grew that D-Day's grand design might collapse from within. Not by German guns, not by fortifications, but by the very air power that had been entrusted to secure victory. Men and machines, trained and primed, hovered on the knife edge of disaster, waiting for a signal that might never arrive in time. And as the first waves approached the beaches, a silent question lingered over every cockpit and command post. Could the greatest armada in history survive the chaos it carried within itself? Only days before the invasion, a decision rippled through Allied headquarters that would leave ground crews and pilots alike scrambling in disbelief. Every aircraft assigned to D-Day would be painted with black and white stripes. The so-called invasion stripes were not a suggestion. They were an imperative. Messengers, phones, and radios carried the command from command posts to airfields, yet no one was fully prepared for the scale of the task. Thousands of planes awaited their mark, each wing and fuselage a canvas against the clock. For the men on the tarmac, the order was both simple and impossible. They faced fleets of bombers, fighters, and transports that had been polished, tuned, and inspected for weeks. Now, with hours to spare, they were asked to paint bold, precise bands that could be seen from miles above. Brushes were scarce, rollers improvised, and paint flew in clouds, sticking to uniforms, engines, and the exhausted hands of mechanics who had long surpassed the limits of fatigue. Each stroke carried the weight of lives yet to fly, yet the men worked in near silence, driven by a mixture of fear and discipline. The logic behind the stripes was straightforward if urgent, high-contrast patterns that pilots could recognize instantly at distance and at speed. In the maelstrom of thousands of aircraft, every wing might otherwise blur into a ghost of friend or foe. The stripes were a simple answer to an impossibly complex problem, a visual semaphore to cut through chaos. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it was monumental. Pilots who first climbed into cockpits and saw their own planes transformed were struck by the sudden clarity. What had once been a gray, shapeless mass now became a mosaic of black and white, a pattern that leapt from the haze of early morning and the smoke of anti-aircraft fire. Recognition would come faster, decisions would be sharper, mistakes fewer. And yet, no one could know if it would be enough to prevent the catastrophe that had haunted every rehearsal and every aircrew's memory. The operation descended into a race against time. Hours slipped past as more aircraft were moved into hangars, lifted onto scaffolding, and painted with painstaking care. Each squadron faced its own logistical nightmare. Brushes ran dry, paint cans tipped, lines wavered under shaking hands. Night fell and the work continued under floodlights, a city of men and machines straining against the clock. Squadrons improvised, using mops, rags, and anything that could hold pigment. Some planes received their bands from hurried stencils, others bore the uneven hand of exhaustion. Yet through it all, the message was clear. The markings were not cosmetic. They were survival, a visual lifeline, a shared code that might save a pilot from death by his own gun. By the early morning of June 6, the eerie effect became apparent. Over the fields and along the coast, an armada of aircraft emerged, each wearing the same unmistakable stripes. They moved as one, yet each was distinct, a warning and a promise painted in black and white. In the chaos to come, the bands would flash across the sky, guiding men and machines alike. But the question remained, would it be enough to hold back the deadly confusion that still loomed? Commanders clung to a quiet certainty. If confusion had been the enemy of air operations, then clarity, however bold, could be its antidote. They believed that high-contrast stripes painted across fuselage and wing would cut through the chaos of thousands of aircraft converging on a single battlefield. In briefings and meetings, generals and air marshals spoke with calm authority, insisting that this one visible change might save countless lives. It was not an elegant solution, but in their eyes, it was simple, immediate, and necessary. Aircrews were summoned to understand the new order. Briefings emphasized that aesthetics were now irrelevant. Survival took precedence. Pilots, navigators, and gunners were told that the stripes were more than paint. They were lifelines. Each line, each band, was a signal, a promise that a comrade in the sky could distinguish friend from foe in a heartbeat. The doctrine of recognition replaced doctrine of form, and men absorbed the message with a mixture of relief and unease. For some, it was almost impossible to accept that a crude stripe could prevent death in the maelstrom to come. Mechanics, however, embraced it with conviction. The men who scrubbed, greased, and calibrated engines saw in the bands a tangible expression of control, a rare element they could shape amid the uncontrollable. Brushes and rollers became instruments of hope. Cans of black and white paint were elevated to the status of strategic tools. Each stroke was a quiet act of defiance against the randomness of battle, a belief that simple human action could contain the sprawling complexity of war. Beyond the practical, the stripes carried profound symbolism. They represented unity among Americans, British, Canadians, and free forces who shared the skies above Normandy. National markings, long a source of pride, were now subordinate to a common visual language. In every hangar and on every tarmac, men from different nations saw themselves bound together by a single purpose, painted across wings and fuselage. The stripes were functional, yes, but they were also a statement of shared fate and collective resolve. Bomber groups, long plagued by uncertainty and identification, placed their trust in the new markings. Pilots imagined their formation flying over enemy territory, trusting that fighters would see the stripes first, and that guns would not open